Chapter 16. In 8 years, Tag had put out 4 albums with an average of 11 songs apiece. That left Roxy with approximately 3 hours of music. Not all that much, she thought, when she first sat down with her phone. Not all that much until she had to replay a good number of them so she could really hear the lyrics. She was locked away for the whole day, and by the time the last song on the last album had played, she graduated to watching every live video he'd posted on Facebook. 2 days later, she was only halfway through, and the whole exercise had messed up her emotions irrevocably. She had been much too pragmatic of a teenager, she decided. How had she not melted into a puddle at his feet whenever he held her gaze as he sang? Had she known all along that they couldn't have a happily ever after? Had she guarded her heart even then? She was looking up Tag's previous tours, grimacing at his vigorous schedule, when her phone rang with a video call. Hope flitted through her heart that maybe Tag hadn't meant the unspoken words that this was it for good when he'd walked away. But the caller ID said it was her older sister calling. "Hey, Rox." Taylor grinned and then held up her 6-month-old son to pretend to give his auntie smooches. "What's up? Holy cow, sis, you look terrible." Roxy inspected herself for the first time in a couple of days. Bags under her eyes, which were red and puffy from the number of times one of Tag's songs had brought her to tears, or the fact that she'd driven the love of her life away had caught up with her and she'd started sobbing. "I'm fine, just doing a lot of introspection." "About?" Taylor raised an eyebrow and stashed Tucker in a baby seat next to her, turning her full attention to the phone call. "Love, how much Tag probably makes and if he can afford a lot of plane tickets. The fact that the romantic part of my brain is maybe broken." She slumped her head down onto the table. Taylor whistled. "Okay, so he makes a lot of money. That's the one thing I can answer for you. And maybe now was not the best time to talk about what I called to talk about." Roxy sat back up and waved her hand. "I could use the distraction. And a shower." "So, how much you love him has finally caught up with you?" Taylor asked in a low voice, frowning, her expression full of so much sympathy it almost made Roxy break down again. Roxy shook her head, shrugged, and batted those words away too. "Distraction," she insisted, although her voice cracked. "Well, this is a doozy of one, and it could be kind of awkward, so buckle up." Taylor rubbed her lips together and took a deep breath. "Gavin and I want to move back to the ranch. I know we left you to it for a long time, and the ranch probably feels like it's yours now, but Dad did leave it to all of us. We're absolutely open to you discussing what you think is fair for the land or something. I don't know, Rox. That place is a part of me, too." Roxy laughed, and it felt good. "I won't make this awkward. It's like when Savannah got married. This ranch is as much yours as it is mine, and I'd never begrudge you that." She smiled and tilted her head. "I can't help picturing a row of matching houses after I'd built mine." Her voice cracked. She wanted those matching houses, didn't she? She maybe wanted Tag more, and having Gavin and Taylor around meant that Taylor could take a bigger role. Bellamy insisted, and was right, that Roxy wasn't needed all the time for the ROC and the ranch house to run smoothly. But maybe having Taylor around would be mentally freeing. Maybe she could drag her feet less about doing what she should have done all along. "Roxy," Taylor frowned. "Distraction," Roxy insisted, and waved her hand around, but her voice came out awfully watery. "Sweetie, there has got to be a way to work this out," Taylor said anyway, and Roxy didn't miss that her sister's eyes shone with empathetic tears. Poor, tender-hearted Taylor. "Is there?" Roxy huffed and stood up, bringing her phone along with her as she moved to the stove to heat up some canned chicken noodle soup. How pathetic. At least it was the expensive kind if she couldn't have some of Bellamy's, or even her mom's. She flipped on the stove and turned to grab a pot from her cupboard. "Of course," Taylor said. "I know you hate the idea of Nashville, but you could handle part of the year out there, couldn't you, for him?" Roxy flung her hands out. "I think so, yes, but what if I get bitter about having to give up this life? What if I push him to stop singing? Or what if him cutting back makes him unhappy and he gets bitter?" She leaned back, putting her hands behind her and slumping. Taylor laughed. "You are overthinking this. You can't see the future." But Roxy's scream cut her off. In her distracted state, she put her hand down on the glass top burner of the stove. "Rox," Taylor cried. "I'm okay, I think. Ow, 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 ow." She danced around the kitchen until she got to the sink. She stared down at the already blistering white skin of her hand and gagged. This could definitely be called a distraction. "Thanks for the advice, Taylor. I think I have to go to urgent care." Roxy sat in the exam room, clenching her unburned hand into a fist and wishing that the ibuprofen she'd taken would kick in. She was so stupid. Tag had her in such a fix that she needed to figure out something, and soon. Her embarrassment intensified when a tap came on the door and Nash's voice said, "How are things today?" Roxy. He glanced down at the chart of his hand, which he must have just picked up from the nurse if he didn't realize he was coming in to see her. Hey, hey. He still stared at her rather than the chart and scrubbed at the back of his neck. Looks like you've come down with something, he said, which she figured wasn't a bad guess considering how awful the glimpse of her face had been when she'd video chatted with Taylor. Crying in pain as Bellamy drove her into town for both her hand and Tag probably hadn't helped the situation. No, burned my hand. She held it up for him. He frowned. How did you do that? His awkwardness stopped, replaced with concern as he sat on the wheeled stool and came up toward her. Put my hand on a stove? Nash's eyebrows shot up as he looked from her hand to her face. That doesn't sound like you. It's been a rough few days. You're not... His awkwardness returned and he spun away to pull on some gloves as though he just remembered she was a patient. About us? He asked, avoiding her gaze. No, I'm sorry. She dropped her voice, upset that she had to have this conversation now. But it hadn't been a full lie when she told Tag that she and Nash were on a break, so this conversation had to come up sometime. No, he waved her off and met her gaze again. You were right. It's my fault, though, from years of running away so that I didn't even understand what I was doing myself. I hate myself a little that you got caught up in that. She moved to take his hand and then grimaced. He looked down at the floor. I was pretty angry at first. It felt like maybe all along I'd just been a distraction. I'm sorry, she said, her voice low, because maybe he was right and that made her the worse. Worse than Tag Turner dropping into her life and making a mess. He looked back at her, a smile plastered on his face. But the more I thought about what you said, the more I realized we were just good friends. Perfect friends, really. And we should have just stayed that way. Yeah, she nodded, frowning, and grateful that he'd accepted everything in stride. So like Nash. His smile turned more genuine. So apology accepted. Unlike you and Tag, we do live in the same town, and I'd rather you didn't run away every time you have to encounter me. It would make treating this injury hard. He paused. Unless you're not going to be in town for long? She sighed. I guess that's part of the problem. I don't really know. He reached over and laid a hand on her leg, his expression full of the friendship he'd just spoken of. In all honesty, you look awful, Rox. Nashville might be what I'd prescribe. That's what I was afraid of.